Welcome. How has the federal government managed to increase its control over state education, both at the K-12 and college level? Well, the obvious answer is money, but there's more to it than that.
The Baker Brief with law professor John Baker. Your weekly dispatch from the battlefield of ideas.
We've already talked a little bit about the Commerce Clause with regard to the regulation of railroads and the beginning of the administrative state. Our focus now is going to be on the Spending Clause and a little known clause, and that involves the lands, the federal lands. So the Land Clause, which is Article 4, Section 3, was very important, at least up until the Civil War. Why? Even before the Constitution was enacted, Congress passed what's called the 1785 Lands Act. And that governed the sale of lands, the Western lands. In this case, it was those in what was called the Northwest Territory. We'll go through those states when we get up to a map of it. But in this area, Congress had control of these lands. And what did they do? Well, they set out rules for buying the lands. But Congress also, this is the Continental Congress, also gave certain lands to states for the purpose of what? Education. Now that's in 1785. That's before the Constitution in 1787. What happens in 1787 is the Northwest Ordinance itself. And that adds something to what was in the Lands Act. That is, there becomes a purpose. What does that say? Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. That's a critical notion. And this is 1787, the summer of the Constitutional Convention, the same time. So this is actually before ratification of the Constitution, but after it is quickly reenacted, the Northwest Ordinance, and it governs the territory that we've been talking about, the states in that territory. So what does this mean? It means that many of these lands ended up being used for purposes of religion, because religion and education were tied up together. People like to deny or ignore that and just say it was all about public schools. There weren't any public schools back then. That's a later invention. No, it's something else altogether. That'll be important because as we go along after the Civil War, things begin to change. Here are the states that you have there: Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, parts of Wisconsin, and Minnesota. The Lands Act was the ability, gave the federal government the ability to raise money by selling off land and giving money. But that was not the Spending Clause. That's something else. We'll get to that in a minute. Well, why would we have in the Northwest Ordinance this emphasis on religion and morality? Well, it largely comes from Massachusetts, and it was based on the educational system that they had developed in their own townships. So what do we have? We have the desire on the part, certainly of those in Massachusetts, but generally the founders, that people had to be educated for two purposes. One was to be able to read the Bible. You couldn't read if you couldn't read. So that was one, but also for purposes of good government, it was considered absolutely essential for education. And you couldn't have an informed citizenry if they were ignorant. So the Commerce Clause is different from the Spending Clause. Both are important to the administrative state, but originally the importance was with the Lands Act. That's how Congress encouraged education. How did they manage to increase the control over time? That's what we want to look at. as in many areas of our culture, things began to change in the 1960s. And one of the most important changes for many purposes was the Supreme Court's decisions in what are called the prayer cases, basically banning Bible reading or prayers in the public schools. Never mind that the states were doing that because they were expected to and required to do it as part of the Northwest Ordinance and subsequent ordinances. It was expected that the states were getting these lands and they would in fact promote religion along with teaching and morality. That's essential, but that changes. Well, that creates a vacuum. Why? Because education is more than simple training. It's not a mechanical thing. There's a vacuum. That vacuum begins to be filled by the U.S. Department of Education. It's really formed in 1979, although earlier in 1867, it was briefly a Department of Education, but then downgraded. And it did certain things over the many years in between, but it's really when the teachers' unions and others get together and lobby Congress to have a Department of Education, and of course, much more money involved in it, that things begin to change. Now, at the time when the Department of Education was created, the three branches in the federal government didn't really care that much about the text of the Constitution. So the most important realization is that there really is no constitutional authorization for a Department of Education. And it's been much criticized on those grounds. All departments of the federal government, whether they're cabinet departments or other departments, have to be authorized by Congress. And Congress is supposed to act only on or according to its enumerated, that is, limited powers. But that hasn't stopped the Congress for many decades. So although there is nothing in the Constitution about it, it couldn't have been clearer from what I've already told you regarding the origin of the relationship between the federal government and the state government by gifts of property, that it recognized that it didn't have control over it. So most parents today still believe that education of the children is really the responsibility of the parents, which they work cooperatively with their local and state governments for funding. That's how it operates. The education department was, however, created for the real purpose of controlling the states through a greatly expanded and abused spending power. Now, some members of state and local school boards are more than happy to submit to whatever federal regulations there are, as long as there's money. And there are others who are really committed to the same leftist agenda, so they have no problem submitting to it. Hopefully, we can tie all this together in our next program when we talk about how the federal government has been struggling against red state in terms of control of education. I hope you'll join me at that time.
To ensure your continued access to the Baker Brief, please note our additional channels listed below. And remember to like and subscribe using the bell icon.